All right, greetings from the Dark Continent, Conscious Caracal here, or Adams van Sail, here to shine a light today, not specifically on something just in South Africa, actually on a phenomenon that we're seeing in South Africa and abroad in the wider Western world, but also in the world at large, and that is the ever-accelerating 24/7 news cycle and its consequences. And joining me here today to discuss this very pertinent topic is a guest that I think the vast majority of my audience will recognize, the frog himself, the Prudentialist. Welcome back on the show.
Thanks for having me back on again. It's been a hot minute, and I'm very happy to speak with you.
And you've been, I completely understand, because you've been quite busy. You have so many invites, it seems, to be a guest on so many shows. You've got multiple podcasts of your own, quite the commentator. And at the same time, you are now joining us today from a very early morning in the United States, I reckon. So at the same time, thank you very much for taking time out of your day to come chat to me and the audience today.
Oh, anytime to talk to a friend.
Fantastic. So the topic today is actually based on a topic and a theme that you quite often discuss on your own podcast, the Digital Archipelago, and often on your guest appearances as well, most notably on Oren McIntyre's platform. And it's this phenomenon of the ever-accelerating news cycle, where back in the day, even just a few decades ago, a certain news story would grip the public's imagination and attention for almost an entire year, or at least a few months on end. At the end of the year, usually, or this is how I remember it growing up, you could name like the top 5 stories very easily of the year that garnered the most attention. And that's not the case anymore, quite clearly. At the moment, it used to be the story of the month. Now it's the story of the week. And now it seems to almost be the story of the day where we find ourselves. A lot of people forget. I mean, it's become almost like a cliche at this point, but on a weekly basis, you see a post from some big conservative account on X that goes something along the lines of, remember that Trump was almost assassinated a few months ago. Remember that story? But I mean, it might be a bit cliche and cringe at this point to remind people of it. But at the same time, they're touching on something very relevant, something that's happening. And it's exactly this, the fact that the current thing is a weekly phenomenon, sometimes a daily phenomenon.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it has a lot to do with how much more information the average person has to process with relation to their own daily lives. I think that you had summarized it perfectly. Several years ago, you could name the top 5 or 10 news stories of the year or the decade, the biggest events that were hard to nail down. But because the average person is now on social media, has a news feed that they can access that is custom tailored to what they're interested in or what they desire to know about, they're now having to deal with, 1,000, if not 1,000,000 times more information and data points than the previous generation would have to. In the advent of television and newspapers and international correspondence and the wire, a well-to-do, well-read person 100 years ago or even 60 years ago had a pretty well-rounded understanding of what was going on in the world. At least they thought so, because they had only a limited number of data points that they could work with, which made it very easy to put together a mental picture of what was going on. But if you compare that to today, where the mental picture you have in your head or these data points that you're trying to point and make sense of the world can change literally the moment you refresh your timeline or you press the refresh key on your internet browser, all of a sudden, you have new information you have to work with. And I think that it drives a particular subset of the viewer base or the readership insane, because it's very hard to keep track of all this information going on at once. And so it makes stories like the former president almost being assassinated easily forgettable, and I think it's because we can, we say that a photo or a picture has 1,000 words, but what does that mean for those thousands of words when there are more photographs than ever? If you try and think about famous photos from the past, say a photo from September 11th, 2001, or Nelson Mandela in the 1990s. Those are famous photos that people can kind of remember. But if you ask in the last 15 years, what's a famous photo people can remember? It's harder to nail down specific ones because there's just a million more photos to analyze. So I think that's a big consequence, is that there's just more information that we have to sift through, and it's harder to say what is important and what isn't.
I mean, just the story, the failed assassination attempts, plural, aside for a moment, just the mugshot of Donald Trump alone would have been one of the iconic photographs of the century. And at the moment, it almost doesn't even feel like one of the most iconic photographs of the past few years. I mean, I can't even, to use myself as a case study, I can't remember if that photograph was published this year or last year.
I think it was published last year in August
Oh.
of 2023. I'm almost positive. I had a
See, but you're saying almost positive, but
almost
in any other time you would have been 100% positive, absolutely sure.
Well, and it's true, because you can think about internet trends or viral stories. I mean, for a short period of time, there was a train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, that sort of gripped the national news headlines,
Right.
or at least for a certain portion of the country, the United States, for a few months. But for me, that was the longest time I had seen any news story or headline really grip the attention that way. And in part, I think it is, in fact, that when you have so many data points to work with, it's easier for pundits, conservative, liberal, whatever, to use those as a platform or a jumping off point to make their case on a partisan level. And when you do that, it makes the importance or the gravity of those stories less, they weigh less, because now they've turned into partisan issues. And I think that that's just a natural consequence, that there's more information to work with that you can use to attack your political foes or enemies. And when that happens, it's harder for, say, a less politically engaged person like myself or yourself to have discernment in determining, well, what really is important, or is this just another line of attack from a respective political party or group?
Right. And I would go as far as to say that I'm convinced that our brains just, humans weren't made to process this amount of rapid fire information on a daily basis constantly. I mean, the social media feed is just almost the perfect example of this phenomenon, where you're scrolling or doom scrolling and constantly being bombarded with information. Whereas in the past, as you already touched on, in the past, the amount of important information or world-changing information that the average person was exposed to on a daily or a weekly or even a monthly basis was very limited. And now at the moment, you are being bombarded with breaking news, the big capital letters, breaking news, every few minutes on your social media feed, because every minute, literally, news is breaking all across the world, whether that be a flood in India or some terrorist attack in the Middle East or some train derailment in the United States, whatever it may be. There is always, in a world of 8 billion people, there's bound to be breaking news every minute of every day. But with the new social media feed format, you are constantly bombarded with information that even just a few years ago you would not have any idea about even happening. And it's often information that isn't even really relevant to you. I mean, while, for example, a flood killing 1,000 people in, let's say, in China is a tragedy, at the same time, this is the type of story that would not have really reached someone reading the newspaper, or actually just thinking about world events on an instantaneous basis just a few years ago. You would maybe hear about it in conversation somewhere down the line, but it would almost be like a little information footnote.
Absolutely. And this was being discussed about long before you and I were born. The great Canadian media theorist and scholar Marshall McLuhan wrote in 1964, and he's talking about television and sort of the news wire. So, I mean, again, I think you can really cross apply this to today.
In the internet era, the television news cycle almost seems quaint.
It really does. But I mean, but when you think about the television news cycle, or what you said, all this information to process, it is an attempt to artificially expand our consciousness and what we're trying to perceive. And so he wrote in 1964, Quote, electric speed in bringing all social and political functions together in a sudden implosion has heightened human awareness of responsibility to an intense degree. It is this implosive factor that alters the position of the black man, the teenager, and some other groups. They can no longer be contained in the political sense of limited association. They are now involved in our lives as we are in theirs, thanks to electric media. And so, like you said, we can be aware of a flood that happens in China that kills, 1,000 people outright. But at the same time, you live halfway around the world, or you live on the other side of the globe, like I do, and you're wondering, well, what does this really have to apply for me? And it expands our ability to look elsewhere rather than the problems in our own respective countries and our own respective communities. And, the English had a great term for this when criticizing all these interest groups for other parts of the world or in their colonial territories about telescopic philanthropy. Well,
Right.
if I'm always constantly looking outward and I'm never looking at my own issues, then the internet's a great place for that sort of distraction. I can now constantly be aware of what's going on in a conflict that I have nothing to do with, or I can be inundated with information about a flood and relief efforts, and that leaves all sorts of room for us to be almost paralyzed with information. The average person is just so constantly on edge because it seems like the world is falling apart, but it only seems that way because you have access to information that your parents and grandparents never did, despite the fact that these things happened all the time.
Hmm. Right, and I mean, you mentioned something very important there, and that's the competition between the local and the global. Where usually, I mean, the cliche or the stereotype is that in a small town, the news stories are also small to match the town, but they almost relatively to the town size feel big. I mean, a tree falls down in a storm and crushes the school principal's car. That's the front page. That's on the front page the next day in the local newspaper. But now that story is competing in the mind and in the attention span of the average reader with the story of, for example, a nuclear threat in a brewing conflict in the Middle East, or massive natural disaster in Malaysia or some other country on the other side of the world, where, let's say, the casualty count is already in the thousands. Now that story, that quaint local story that literally up until very recently would have been the front page story in the local newspaper, everyone would have been talking about it. It's competing for the attention span of the people in that small town that all have smartphones, that are seeing the breaking news of global scale events happening, and it just doesn't stand a chance. But at the same time, I think it's driving people insane to some extent. It's stretching, as you said, our consciousness and our not conscientiousness, but what we are aware of happening around us, stretching it to a breaking point where we as humans just weren't made for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the important things to consider is that, well, when we're not made for it, what do? We offload that extra stress, and we offload sort of that data elsewhere. So, I mean, a good example of this really is the extensions of our personal self. It's our online presence. It's the way that we process information in work emails or group chats and so on. And we sort of create these prosthetic alternatives to what our brains can't handle. So we create this sort of duality between, okay, this is the personal self, the flesh, the blood, the brain, but also this is also myself, the digital, the online personality, the information, the following that I have. And when that happens, sometimes that doesn't always, I would think, rather mesh together particularly well, because you can't really separate your online self from your personal. Some people can, and I think that that's sort of an adaptive trait or a personality trait that is going to be selected for, as the social media and the news cycle doesn't seem to go away anytime soon. So I think that when you consider that we've now developed this extra human, or maybe this almost transhuman, I really don't want to use that word, but you have this extra sense of being able to process time or to simulate events because you have social media, and that all this data comes in all at once, and you sometimes are just so on edge. You're like, I need to take a break. Or, as I've recently written, some people like to jokingly say that nothing ever happens, as sort of a way to say, I'm not processing this information. I refuse to be subject to whatever talking point or propaganda that you're wishing to subject me to. So I'm just not going to worry about it. But that's a consequence of living in a news cycle that's no longer just 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's virtually every second of every time and of every moment. And if you're not participating, you're missing out on a highly competitive, monetized take economy, whether it be on X or on YouTube or on blogs or working or writing for a newspaper, where your take could easily make you a paycheck, but if you're not participating, you're quote unquote missing out. And that means you have to subject yourself to all kinds of insane, informational hazards that would require you to know about what's going on in the world 24/7. And I think it's important for people to just sometimes remember, you don't have to know everything. You can say, I don't know. It's quite a liberating feeling that you, especially when you do
Right.
commentary like this.
Yeah, and I mean, there you're touching on something very important, that is pretty much the news as consumer product. I mean, as entertainment product, where, I mean, this is a talking point as old as news itself. But I mean, as you mentioned earlier, this all of this that we're discussing now was set in motion long before you and I were even born. But I mean, the news it's just what's happening is news is not increasingly becoming an entertainment product. It is just more explicitly becoming so. I mean, the best example I remember recently was the whole Titanic submersible story, of the submersible of the billionaires in it last year that went down to the Titanic wreckage, and then it disappeared, and then we were looking for it in a 24-hour cycle. All the news channels had like a literal oxygen timer on it, showing how many hours of oxygen are left before everyone perishes on the submarine. Meanwhile, afterwards, if I remember correctly, it was revealed that actually, no, the authorities looking for the submarine already had ample information and proof that the submarine had actually imploded, and they were just looking for the wreckage.
Yeah, that's exactly what had happened. And I mean, if you want to even take an earlier example, at least in the United States, in part because the issue was so incredibly politicized as it was really all over the globe, was the response to COVID. And if you
Right.
in certain news channels in the United States, CNN is the best example, because I just remember it vividly. Is that you could walk into an airport or a hospital or any place that was playing CNN in a public space, and on their headline, Chirons, there was a small counter for coronavirus hospitalizations, the number of people who had died, the number of people who had been vaccinated. And I mean, that was just a constant timer that you could watch the numbers go up in real time, as if they were trying to flood you with this sense of dread and concern, and to sway your point of view. And I mean, I think that that's the important thing, is that news has become a sales as service and SaaS sort of technique. And in doing so, the idea of the pundit or the commentator is that they all focus on I'm the one who has the answer, or they develop these parasocial relationships in order to do so. And there was this great article, I want to say it was from The Verge, I'd have to find it and look it up again, but it was talking about how we've kind of reinvented the old style of news anchor, except they're far more friendly and socially accessible. So now it's a Walter Cronkite that you can buy a beer with or something like that. And the fandomification of news has really led us to constantly, be pursuing, well, who has the best take here, or who should I offshore my opinions and moral judgments to? So for the average person who doesn't have time to think about these things, oh, well, the person I like says that this is what's going on, and I like them, so I'm just going to trust their moral judgment and go from there, not thinking how easily they could be being taken advantage of.
Just before we continue, I just want to give the chat some attention. I see you're receiving quite the fanfare. North Sea says, great guest. Caravaggio says, present company excluded, of course. Gentlemen such as yourselves act as sense makers in these crazy times. And Second Horizon says, thanks, CC. I love this content. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for the kind words there. Christoph Smith says, wat is hierdie middagetenstroom? What is this? Lunchtime stream. Yes, this is a little bit of a bonus episode, just because when I was moving and when I was in the United States, of course, for work, I was about 3 or 4 weeks, I think, or more than, I think almost a month and a half that I didn't create content. So I want to be giving you something to chew on here on the channel, and I'm very glad that people are enjoying the content. But yeah, to get back to the topic, I mean, that's where the whole meme of the current thing comes from. I mean, it's not cutting edge commentary to point out the current thing phenomenon, but I mean, that's it. People and the commentary economy that you mentioned there revolves around the current thing or even anti-current thing. So people either subscribe to channels that discuss the current thing in one sense, or they subscribe to channels that give them a narrative or takes that are anti-current thing, or just always a contrarian opposite to whatever the mainstream is saying, which is also just as useless of analysis, if you ask me. But anyway, at the same time, this whole current thing economy, it seems to be a desperate attempt by the mainstream, or rather, let's say the legacy media, because they're no longer mainstream, not to any recognizable extent. But it seems to be a desperate coping mechanism to just try and keep a grip of their industry and of their market share in a time where they've pretty much become obsolete. Their model is no longer really has a place within the internet era, and they've been completely surpassed by those that they hold in very clear contempt, those without journalism degrees, but that do the same or even better at analyzing whatever is happening around them. But it seems to me that this whole thing, I mean, I wrote about this the other day, the phenomenon of the hero and the villain of the week. In South Africa, the legacy media is now currently very much gripped in these death throes of every week there has to be a villain, mostly 9 or 10 times a villain of the week, and then there needs to be a 2 minutes of hate around this villain, and their new role within society that they're trying to fashion for themselves is that they are the keepers of the ritual of this 2 minutes of hate when we have identified our villain. And this week it actually quite spectacularly backfired in their faces, because they went after, I'm not going to go into all the details, but they went after a celebrity in South Africa called Jan Braai. He is so Braai is a South African version of barbecue, grilling meat over an open fire, and he's like a celebrity braaier, barbecuer here in South Africa. And a 44-second clip had been circulating online that appeared to show him when he was handing out free hot dogs on the street. It appeared to show that he was ignoring a non-white customer there on the street. And then the largest news organization in South Africa, News 24, took just social media vibes and a 44-second clip, and they made like a headline front page story out of it, that this guy appears to, or they pretty much called him a racist, said that this guy is ignoring customers that are not white. And then everyone in the replies, thanks to what social media has enabled, was able to actually just post the entire CCTV footage in the replies and show that they are completely just fabricating this entire story, to which they posted like a begrudging non-apology. But that's I think enough context there. The phenomenon of the villain of the week seems to be the direction that a lot of the legacy media is going in, when you can't really muster up enough attention and clicks just through sensational stories. You have to make it more human, more personal, by actually directing people's almost like normie sadism in the direction of like an acceptable target. I think this is something that you actually coincidentally recently on your podcast, the Digital Archipelago, was describing or discussing with your co-host Gio.
Yeah, absolutely. Is that when you have the opportunity to set the agenda, and I mean, I think that what you had described is just a perfect example, is that you can fact check all you want, or that you can be contrarian and say, well, actually, this is what the media really wants you to, miss out on, or this is, stories the media won't tell you. And again, what that does is it elevates the differences in say, power, for as much as we can ignore the mainstream press or the paper of record, so the New York Times here in the United States, they still have institutional power. They're still backed more or less by the state and so on. And so it becomes very difficult in that respect to counter that narrative, although public trust in those institutions, are at an all-time low. But you still have to deal with the fact that it's not just a a newspaper or headline that you're trying to overcome. It's just like Caravaggio says here in the chat comment that you had up there. It's the algorithm that you have to fight against as well. And if not, if you can overcome that or hijack that algorithm, it's very difficult to get the actual truth or a prevailing counter narrative out of the way. And as much as people may not like him or have their own opinion of him, Elon Musk's $44 billion purchase of Twitter has been an excellent way to sort of fight back against that. And it has its own ups and downs, obviously, but I think that we can argue that his purchase of Twitter has made the ability for different news narratives to come out in ways that prior to his purchase, I don't think we would have ever focused on. I mean, there are people in the United States that believe the assassination attempts, plural, on Donald Trump have been staged or faked. And I imagine that those would have a much louder and a much more, vivid presence in the public consciousness if it weren't for the social media buyout that he had participated in. Because if anyone remembers old Twitter or old X, you could be suspended very easily. These kind of news stories would not make it to the front page, and these sort of left-leaning conspiracy theories would be front and center, questioning the validity of the attack and everything like that.
Right. I mean, the best term for that would be blue anon, the blue anon theories. But I wanted to mention as well, just a final note on that bizarre story that I've shared there of the largest news organization in South Africa just going after some barbecue celebrity, for a lack of a better way to describe for my foreign audience what he is. And the funny thing is, the journalist that went after him with that story, with that false racism story, people were posting one of his ex posts, almost ironically, where he says that it's so difficult for journalists these days. We still do our best to go after those in power and to keep them, hold them to account. I just think to myself, yes, holding those people in power to account, like this barbecue celebrity guy, Jan Braai, real establishment icon. But there's another topic that I wanted to actually segue a little bit to in regards to that outrage cycle, that villain of the week. I mean, one of the most insidious details of this particular episode of false racism allegations in South Africa was that News 24 went out of their way in their initial post on X, now deleted, to actually say, well, this celebrity, Jan Braai, he actually just uses, that's his what do you call it? His brand name, but not his real. They actually said, well, this is his brand name, and they emphasized this is his real name to make it more personal, to make it more laser focused, to make the outrage a bit more painful. And what stood out to me was the fact that, well, firstly, on the one side, the non-apology. The other fact is that even their non-apology was behind a paywall. And then secondly, the fact that I think, and this is the topic that I wanted to get to, is the fact that I think the corporate world, at least in South Africa, I don't know what the situation in America is, but the corporate world, our social structures, everything around us in regards to social organization and groupings, whether that be your employer or your social group or your family, those structures just aren't adapted to this form of like mass fabricated outrage, because in the traditional setting of when you were living in a small town or a community, if there was someone that a very, very large chunk of the community was exiling or accusing of some type of crime or indecent behavior, the almost knee-jerk reaction would be that you take it seriously if there's enough noise around a certain type of person. That would be the natural response for humans only a few decades ago, so maybe a century ago. But now today, in the era of the internet, where you can create fabricated outrage and have a mob of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people almost instantaneously, it almost hijacks that, not wholesome, but that natural part of human behavior, where it's almost like the saying goes, where there's smoke, there's fire. But in the internet era, you can just have constant artificial smoke constantly around any target that you want. And I think that's what makes it so insidious. I don't think companies, employers, organizations in the 21st century have caught up. I don't think we're ready for this level of like targeting of people and manufacturing outrage. I still see to this day 9 out of 10 times, even though you've seen so many hoaxes and outrage fabrications that are actually then revealed to be based on nothing or based on lies, you still see 9 out of 10 times corporations, organizations, political parties buckle to this pressure because they're still running on a older model of thinking. They're still running on older software when it comes to how do you handle outrage? How do you handle a mob of people saying you are associated with a bad person or a person that is guilty of immoral behavior?
Well, I think that one of the things we have to consider is that everyone likes to have a scapegoat. Everyone likes to say that, well, as complex as the situation may be, if we blame this party or this bad person, then we can go from there and it will significantly resolve our issues. Not in sort of like the Rene Girard, scapegoating sense, but that it is easier to have a pressure release valve and say, we're going to blame this person, or we're just going to call him a racist, or we can say we can blame this large scale sort of complex where they say, oh, it's racism, or oh, that it's this, or it's inequality, and so on and so forth. And it never gets to the core crux of the issue. And so now you have people shadowboxing with this imaginary enemy or entity, and then it's easier to go from there. And because it's so easily constructible, and to tell other people that this is actually what happened or this is how it's going to go, the real problems or the real causes get obfuscated. And for instance, whether it be in South Africa or here in the United States, is that these media institutions have very specific agendas that they wish to accomplish and to propagandize the population into believing that, these people are evil or that this is actually what's going on, because it's easier to manufacture outrage against successful, well-to-do people and to rage against the people who are just minding their own business and are trying to survive and to succeed. And now they're going to make it your problem 24/7 all of the time. And that's just going to be the way it happens. Now, that doesn't mean that, scapegoating or blaming a particular person doesn't have its place in time. There are very clear, terrible politicians that are leading things. I mean, you and I talked about this during the Julius Malema trial that you guys had covered. And I mean, obviously, like if the media ever decided to turn on him, that'd be a welcome, refreshing change of pace. But we both know that that's most likely not going to happen because his opinions and his views are sort of wanting to be mainstreamed, and they want that to continue. In the same way that constant politicians, despite 2 attempts on his life, are still saying that Donald Trump needs to be removed, and they don't mean that from office; they mean that from this mortal coil. And that's what they want to do, because that's the expectation of the media, is to ensure that those 2 minutes of hate are properly put on the quote unquote correct targets, and that has its consequences. I mean, to go back in time, if people remember, there was a young high school Catholic school student in the United States by the name of Nicholas Sandmann. And all he's known for is just smiling while someone is yelling at him vitriolically at a March for Life rally several years ago. And he did nothing wrong, nothing at all. But because he was the manufactured subject of hatred, because he was a white Catholic Christian male, and he was standing up for a pro-life position, that automatically made him the enemy against people who were shouting awful vitriolic things at him for being white or being Christian or whatever. And that's what's acceptable, and that's how it's going to be. Thankfully, he went to court. He got a pretty large settlement from a lot of these news companies. But again, it just illustrates that the insult to your reputation are now permanently having a target on your back, and people looking up and knowing your name and like, oh, you're that guy, you're a racist, or whatever that they may think, is going to do far more damage than any sort of monetary settlement's going to do, because that's for the rest of your life. I imagine that now his real name is out there. Your Jan Bry character is going to have the same kind of problem, that people know what his actual name, people can find out where he lives, and make his life far more difficult than it ever was beforehand.
Yeah, but I mean, luckily for him, this episode, the nature of how spectacularly it backfired, I think will actually make sure that hopefully the lasting effects on his career and his reputation are minimal in the negative sense. And I think the lesson that still needs to be learned, I mean, like I said, I feel like we're just as fast as the news landscape is developing and changing, the information landscape is changing, and human psychology and human traditions, and I mean these things, human traditions, for example, traditions are, as Donald Kingsbury said, solutions to problems for which we have forgotten that we forgot were problems in the first place. And the thing about how fast things are changing, the media landscape, the information landscape, I don't think our traditions at the moment are adapting fast enough. Our common sense, our rules of thumb, developed over hundreds of years for different types of situations and problems that commonly arise. But we're entering a new landscape, whether that be in the how the media operates, how communication or information operates, how we interact with technology like artificial intelligence. I mean, how we interact with in the internet sense, just any type of content which you want access to, no matter how horrible it might be. If you look hard enough, you can find it. Putting that at the fingertips of people in such a short amount of time, I don't think our traditions and our rules of thumb can adapt fast enough to really give people a quote unquote immune system against the new developments of our time, or the new phenomena of our time. And it's a worrying thing, because, as I said, these things maybe eventually we will develop the traditions and the habits and the rules of thumb to be able to deal with all these new challenges and demons that we of our time. But it's going to take a long while. I mean, one of the lessons that I've learned through, about a fact like manufactured outrage is that the only way out is through. You don't apologize to people that don't believe in mercy or in forgiveness. And you don't apologize to people who will only use your apology as an admission of guilt and further punishment and grounds for punishment.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that we're going to have to adapt to in real time. I think that this is sort of uh, I guess, like a psychological bottleneck, wherein, what strategies for your mind to cope or process or to offload this informational stress, I think, is going to be a big part of how you manage. Because again, you're not going to apologize to people that hate you, because that's what they want. They want you to grovel, they want you to submit to them. And I think that you're absolutely right. If they don't believe in mercy, if they don't believe in forgiveness or any sense of redemption, there's no point in trying to apply that worldview or that moral system onto them, because they're not going to give you an inch. But at the same time, I think that it's important to take some kind of not necessarily a break, but some kind of ascetical practice. I uninstall the X app on my phone during the weekends. I don't reinstall it until after church on Sundays. And I found that's been sort of a good way to recalibrate my mind, and also to sort of try and stay off my phone more often during the weekends when I'm around friends and family. In part because it's just not your place, I think, for a lot of us to be on there 24/7. It's a great way to lose your physical grounding in the world, because now you're caught up in some sort of conflict that's happening halfway around the world, or some manufactured media outrage because it feels good when you get clicks or likes or retweets. But at the same time, I think that it can significantly distance you from the things that go forward. And I mean, that's one of the earliest things I've ever talked about on this sort of platform, is the concept of digital deracination, that it's so easy for us to get lost in another world, in this sort of form of escapism, that we lose track of what our own home is like, or what's going on in our own communities. I remember you and I had a discussion years ago off the air, where you told me that you were walking down in a major city, and you saw someone who looks just like you, speaking in a perfect Americanized accent, speaking in English. And that I find just to be absolutely bone chilling. It would be to walk somewhere and to say China or anywhere else is just as foreign as the United States, and to hear sort of this YouTuber American California Valley accent, and it's just like excuse me, that does not belong here. But because we are so participatory in this digital space, this global village, as McLuhan might call it, that you kind of go to what makes you money, or what is the socially agreed upon lingua franca. And that is, of course, this Valley, California, or New York style American English, because that's sort of the language of online culture, and that's developed its own sort of tics and so on and so forth. But I think that we're just going to have to, we're watching like a very small rapid fire evolutionary pressure just take place. And I think that you'll see a very clear difference between the kids who were raised without smartphones or raised to read books and play piano versus the kid who's got an iPad in front of him at like the age of 3. Like, those are going to be two vastly different people neurologically speaking, and we're going to live to see the consequences of that.
Right. I mean, that's where these new habits and new rules of thumb and new traditions that I was talking about are actually going to come into play and are going to show their value, is because we're going to have to develop new habits to deal with the new technological challenges of our time. Like, for example, a rule of thumb, like, don't use technology after this time in the evening. Why? No, because my grandfather said that's what you don't do. Why did your grandfather say that? Oh, because his father told him that's what you don't, why you don't do it. Just, that's how habits and traditions form, is that at some point it was very explicitly to solve a problem, but at some point it just becomes like common knowledge, like, you know what they say, and then you give the solution. And this whole phenomenon that we've been discussing here today, it's fascinating. I mean, we could discuss it for hours and hours, because I think it's so relevant to our time. I mean, you and I grew up in this time. I mean, we didn't grow up with the internet to the extent that it was always there. I remember, I always describe it as one day I woke up and the internet was there. And then that was very, very bad, crappy internet. It wasn't even really accessible to anyone, and to normies at least. And then the big revolution came when social media happened, and social media got interfaced with the little mechanical box you have in your hand with your phone. I mean, that gave access, that expanded access to the internet to everyone. But I mean, this whole topic that we've been discussing reminds me of that classic quote from Andy Warhol, where he said that in the future everyone will be famous for 15 minutes. But I mean, I have to say, I think he was being a bit optimistic. I think in the future everyone will be famous for about 2 minutes, maybe a few seconds, and then it's gone again. I mean, and that leads me to the next question that I wanted to ask you. It's a speculative question, so I will allow you to indulge a little bit in speculation, but where's this all heading? I mean, the news cycle, the information cycle is clearly incrementally and increasingly accelerating. But where does it end? Does it end up in the cartoonish, almost absurd situation where everyone is famous for 3 seconds and then they're not? Where you see entire social media empires and careers rise and fall within the matter of seconds? Where do we realistically end up? Where is this going?
I think that you actually give a pretty good outline right there. Is that, people will be famous for 2 minutes, or they will be kings of their own tiny little castles and fiefdom somewhere in their own niche community. I mean,
going to war with other little group chats.
Exactly. And I mean, I think that you kind of see that all the time on X.com or on Twitter. Is that it is really rivalries between one group chat versus another for takes or for drama, because that's what keeps people clicking on you. But I mean, even on a platform as vast and as large as YouTube, even if you are not covering anything remotely political at all, you can become a celebrity or a commentator on something very large, or something very innocuous like automotive repair or firearms or cooking, or however it may be. And as long as you have sort of a niche or unique spin to it, that's a great way to achieve some sort of micro celebritydom. I think it's important for us to realize the absolute scale of these things. I mean, even for channels like ours that are over 10,000 people subscribe to it, that's still an insane amount of people for the human mind to comprehend. I mean, Dunbar's number is about 150 people, and so now you have something that's exponentially larger than that.
Sorry to interrupt you, Prude.
Yeah,
just out of interest's sake, for those in my audience that might not know, what is Dunbar's number?
So Dunbar's number is the alleged number, about 150, that your mind can process and have good relations with, or that you know intimately. So about 150 people in your contacts or your Rolodex of your mind that you can say, oh, that's so and so. He works here. That's my coworker. That's my sister. That's my uncle. That's my aunt. If you live in a small town or a small neighborhood, a lot of people kind of work within that number. Is that there's about 150 people we can readily identify with and kind of know their story or be acquaintances with. Digitally, that's almost impossible because you can be dealing with thousands and tens of thousands of people at all times, and you can cover news stories like you have, or you can make over 1 million impressions very short amount of time, and that's an unfathomable number to consider. But because the internet, as small as it is in terms of these like big platforms like YouTube or so on, even inside those platforms, you can cover something like finance, or even say using a metal detector to find artifacts in like the desert or something. You can become a celebrity that way, and unless people are already into that particular topic, they don't know that you even exist. You can have a channel of like 300,000 people subscribing to you, and that makes you a celebrity for all intents and purposes. But if they don't follow, metal detecting YouTube for whatever reason, you're just you're a king or some dignitary from some faraway land. I think that trend will continue for quite some time, as long as there's an opportunity to make money in it. Because in the past, if you were a fan of something, for instance, my great uncle was a huge fan of Coca-Cola memorabilia. And, you had to find a small mailing list in a magazine to sign up on. And that would be the way that people kept in contact. And there was like a quarterly publication that the fans would put together to let people know what their collections were and what they thought was strange. And of course, that's very niche, and that's very, it seems quaint. But that still exists today, except now it's instantaneous. And there are online communities that can tell you about media or memorabilia that they remember as their youth. I mean, I recently discovered that there's a large community of people online that are dedicated to finding what's known as lost media. So films that have been destroyed in a fire, or television shows that weren't really recorded. Like, their sole mission as a community is to find it and recover it. It's kind of interesting in an archaeological sense, but if you're not interested in that, you're like, oh, who cares? Then all that effort, all that celebrity, all of that information gathering doesn't really mean anything. And so I think that we're going to consistently see a stratification of the news and of the media. So if you're really interested in finance, you have to be constantly plugged into like the finance news, the finance content creator world to know kind of what's going on and to get an idea. The same thing with politics, the same thing with really anything that is newsworthy or you find interesting, whether it be scientific advancements and so on. Because the thing that really has changed from having, say, 3 or 4 newspapers or one radio station or one television broadcast for the news is that there's a million of them now, and they're all one person or one team or one studio trying to put together their best reporting or their best contact network or their best alternative take on the issue, which sometimes can be overly contrarian. And what comes out of that is that, well, when the world is your oyster, you can go looking for all the different types of pearls that you want. And so you and I can more or less speak 2 different languages based on the news that we consume. You and I, of course, kind of inhabit similar spaces, but we're still so far apart because I don't live in South Africa, you're not an American, so our worldviews are vastly different that way. And we can kind of understand because we inhabit similar digital ecosystems, but at the end of the day, unless I'm constantly following what's going on in South Africa, or you're constantly following what's going on in the United States, you and I are 2 separate, citizens of not only just 2 different countries, but 2 different mental headspaces. And I think that trend is going to continue as long as it can make people a lot of money very quickly. And so by that extent, I don't think it's going away anytime soon.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is something I'm constantly reminded of, and it's sobering. It's a nice experience to be reminded of it, but it is sometimes a bit jarring, is that the cliche phrasing is that the internet is not real life. And I think there's a lot of incorrect implications that people draw from that, because the internet has to a certain extent become real life. And I mean, your co-host Gio will be able to do an entire 5-hour episode on why that is. But at the same time, a lot of the stuff happening online just doesn't translate to the real world. It just simply doesn't. I mean, South Africa has had so many in recent years, so many political parties where they have like their official account on X has like 100,000 followers, and their Facebook page has 500,000 likes, and then the election rolls around and they don't even get like 2,000 votes. They don't even register enough to be statistically significant. And this has happened a lot with news stories as well. I mean, the same applies to, and this gets back to the overarching topic of the 24-hour global news cycle, is the fact that, for example, I remember when I was in the United States, I almost took not for granted, but I forgot that, as you mentioned now, Americans aren't just up to date with everything that happens in South Africa. So I was talking to someone that's pretty clued up on global events and news, and I'm like, you remember the riots in South Africa in 2021? He's like, no, not really. And I just think to myself, the riots in 2021 were the largest riots in South African history in the past, at least since 1994. One of the biggest events of rioting and looting in the past 100 years in South Africa. And it's barely it's not even a footnote in this the American commentator's mind, which I don't blame him for, but it's still just, it's jarring sometimes. And I had a similar experience recently where, I can't remember who it was. It's one of the big, it was one of the big like commentators in the online space, someone with like a few 100,000 followers, or like a very big account. No, it doesn't matter. It was a very big anonymous account within our sphere, and I just mentioned one of their viral posts to someone at work casually, and they're like, "I've never heard of that person in my life," and I'm like, "Right, of course you've never heard of that person in your life." And then you need those little buckets of ice water in the face to just realize, yes, what happens online has an effect on the real world, but at the same time, it also doesn't, to a very large extent. There are hundreds of thousands, and in a national case, millions of your fellow compatriots that have never heard of your favorite Twitter accounts that you follow on a daily basis, and whose posts you see on a daily basis, and who you regard as these celebrities or very famous people.
Exactly. And again, if you're not and it goes back, of course, to even like the television experience of, say, our parents or grandparents, is that if you weren't tuned into a particular channel, so I mean, in the United States, if you had 3 or 4, really big news stations or broadcasters, if you were an NBC over ABC kind of lineup person, well, if you don't know what's going on, or which celebrity was on Who's My Line, or To Tell the Truth, right? These game shows with celebrities and so on. And if you weren't paying attention to that, well, you didn't really inhabit the world space of, say, your neighbor or something like that. And of course, the implications of that today is that, oh yes, I know about all sorts of drama, or what people like to call lore, for a particular online character or a personality, but the average person probably has no idea, like you said, who the heck you're talking about. And it's a great way to remind yourself that it influences you more than it influences, say, your friend or your coworker or your neighbor. And it allows you to be sort of this different person, because maybe they're not on social media at all, or maybe they're on Facebook to talk about, their dog, or to keep up with family. And that's the extent of their usage of it. As for you, you've kind of artificially projected your personality, your consciousness, your ideas out into this digital world space where everyone is screaming 24/7, and you're just hoping someone across the aisle from you might hear what you have to say, because everyone's screaming and it's a very loud environment. But when that happens, like you feel good because you feel heard, you feel validated, and there's that human recognition and desire to be heard, seen, and to feel as if what they say matters. And when that takes place, then a lot of people will happily choose to engage in that world and make it their entire being and existence over any other alternative. And I think that that's as clear as present day as, the changes and trends in the United States, where a lot of young people, they wish to be influencers or social media talking heads over engineers or astronauts or anything like that, just because that's the world that they've grown up in. The internet was there from them since they were born and before they were born, and it's going to be there after they're dead. So why not try your best to be something? And that seems the quickest way to be famous nowadays.
Hmm. Well, it's almost become a little bit of a running joke on my channel. The fact that people sometimes in my chat say I'm the only streamer that they watch that actively tells his audience if they have something better to do in real life, they should stop watching the stream and go do that. They can always watch or listen to the replay on another day.
There you go. I try to tell people to do that all the time. I'm not important enough for you to go on and to stop what you're doing to listen to me. The video on demand will be there later. I promise. Please focus on what's important with your life. I'd much rather you be successful, married with children, or have a better career than you are sitting here listening to me.
So I just want to give the chat some attention again. I've starred or marked some comments here. Matwa Waba says, "Don't ever go into politics, Adams. Don't worry, I never will." I was just talking to one of my colleagues yesterday about the fact that how very, very glad I am that I'm not in party politics. It's a fantastic place to be. So don't worry, you won't ever see my face on the ballot ever. Pac-Man Respector says, already here, and he corrected later that he meant Zoomers, so I'll read it in that context. He said, I already hear Zoomers and Alphas talk with TikTok voice. They always sound like they're talking to a chat. Yes, that's a scourge on our society. It should be stigmatized heavily. That's what stigmatization is there for exactly these types of social behaviors. And I mean, that stigmatization as a tool, a social tool, falls into that toolbox that I was talking about earlier of rules of thumb, traditions, habits, stigmas. We're going to have to develop an entire new toolbox for the internet era, and we're very far behind. We better get on that. Caravaggio says, even if the good information we find online must ultimately serve a purpose in our real lives in the real world. That's absolutely, absolutely true. Also, Prude, while I'm reading here, if there's a certain comment that stands out to you when I'm done reading, you can respond to that if you want.
Sure.
Christoph Smith says, we may live on different continents, but bad ideas and trends do spill over into the real world in other countries. Absolutely. I mean,
that's
the
very
whole
true.
idea of wokeness, even if it were to be completely exercised out of the Western world, here in Africa, and specifically in South Africa, it's still going to be here quite a long time. I think the cultural impact of the internet is real. Well, absolutely. I mean, as I said, an example of that is, for example, hearing someone's kid walking and talking in streamer voice. That is the internet being real life. That is the internet having an impact on real life, and it's quite disturbing. And then Christoph Smith says, I remember growing up every Monday, people would discuss the 8 o'clock blockbuster movie on Mnet or ETV. Yes, Christoph Smiths, you and me are in the same generation in that regard. If you didn't watch the 8 o'clock movie Sunday night on Mnet, you couldn't talk to anyone the next day at school, because that's when the latest in fat quotation marks movie premiered, usually about 8 or 7 months after it came out on video, I think, in the United States. People forget there used to be this massive technological and cultural delay relatively to today between South Africa and the United States. That's just completely gone. All right, that wraps up the comments that I marked. I don't know if there's one that stood out to you, Prue, that you wanted to respond to.
I think it was Christoph who had said the implications of cultural impact on other countries. I mean, that's very true. The unfortunate consequence of American style civil rights, disparate impact, critical race theory things on the rest of the world has been just such a nightmare. I mean, for instance, in the United Kingdom, their foreign minister is David Lammy, who is an African or immigrant of some kind, and he's now foreign secretary. And he spoke at the United Nations recently. He was talking about imperialism, and he had made a comment to the Russian UN representative. He had said, "As a black man," and he talked about imperialism and slavery, and it's just like, you did not grow up with that in any way, shape, or form compared to, say, an American black experience. But it illustrates these ideas can be so easily transported, not just via the internet, but also the academy and the popular culture. And a country like Great Britain, who does not have race relations at all, like the issues that we have here in America, it's being exported in the same way that sort of critical race theorists like in the United States, like Kimberly Crenshaw and the rest of them are. You see that kind of language in South Africa as well, in a place where things are far more fraught with danger and real concern than, say, here in the U.S. And unfortunately, that rhetoric and that language has devastating consequences for how people act in their everyday life and how they engage in policy. And that's the unfortunate world that we live in, is how quickly these ideas can take hold. And it's very much like the Columbian exchange, when the European explorers and settlers came to the Americas, is that we got some ideas and we got some fruits and some vegetables and animals out of it, and they got the same thing, but also exposure to diseases that they had no immune response for. And it's the same thing with these ideas. If you don't have an immunological response as a body politic or as a consciousness, it will just run through your society and absolutely destroy you. So despite the fact that they have their origins here in America, there's a large subset of the population, because we were patient zero, we have a greater immune response to it. I mean, there was a poll that came out by Pew Research Center on religion in 2017, and I would love to see the data for it now in 2024, but it said, white American evangelicals had a higher disapproval of homosexual relations and marriage than Muslims that came to the United States. And so it just tells you that there's no real immune system, that if you're from a foreign place and you try and come here, it will colonize your mind. And the consequences, of course, are devastating.
Well, Prud, thank you very much, like I said, for joining us here today. I want to start wrapping up here so I don't keep you for too long. But my last question to you is particularly not one which is going to lead us down another doomish black-pilled path, but rather a more practical question. That is, from what you can see and from your experience, what is the best way to deal with info hazards? I mean, there's no way that we're going to now be able to, you and me, just here formulate the perfect immune response against all the threats and psychological and info hazards that we described in this episode here today. But where's a good place to start? I mean, we can't think of the solution now immediately, but I mean, we could at least do a tiny little micro level contribution to maybe in the future the development of these types of habits, traditions, rules of thumb, stigmas that will benefit future generations, to give them that protection, to give them that type of immune system. Where do you think is the best place to start?
I think the best place to start is going to be sort of with self-examination. How often are you on these places, and what ideas that are towards your understanding of the world, how do they impact your everyday life? What kind of language from the internet are you bringing into your everyday conversations? Are you bringing in sort of meme speak or whatever into conversations with family and friends? I think that once you have a pretty good idea of how it affects you, you can sort of start to formulate habits to either decrease what you consider to be negative or to increase sort of the positive behaviors. Like, are you more conscientious about X, Y, and Z habit? And then if you take that and you go from it, you can do that. I mean, the touching grass thing, as much of it as a meme, I do think some kind of ascetical practice is necessary. I uninstalled Twitter
fasting.
on my phone. Yeah, fasting, exactly. And I mean, for me, I mean, I fast Wednesdays and Fridays with respects to food. But I mean, I think that you can do some kind of digital fast as well during the weekends or whatever works for you per your habits or your beliefs. And I think that that's what's going to start. But you have to start at home, and you have to start with yourself. And once you can model your own behavior and people see that you've changed either for the positive, hopefully, then you can go from there. And I think that that's going to be the biggest thing about it, because if you're constantly being bombarded with this information, you're going to be like many of our friends who are progressive or on the left, who seem constantly sad or mentally ill or depressed all the time. And I don't want that for people, especially on this side of things. And so I think that once you find a way to acknowledge that there are things outside of your control, I'm not going to let this, talking point or propaganda piece affect me the way that it's going to affect others, then I think that's a good start for good psychic hygiene.
And I think that's a topic you're going to hear a lot more about in the future, and increasingly so, psychic hygiene. psychological immune systems, info hazard procedures on how to make sure that you aren't constantly assaulted with just information viruses from the technology that we use. I think that's going to become a critical point of discussion. And that's why I recommend people to check out your podcast as well, the Digital Archipelago that you co-host with Geo, because I think this is a topic you guys often discuss there, and also that's why I invited you to be a guest to talk about this topic, as I think this is something that has been simmering in the background of your minds, particularly relating to the topic of your podcast for a long while. So I think you're the right man for the job to give us some clarity and insights on this particular topic.
Well, thank you for the kind words. I appreciate it.
And yeah, the chat seems to have really enjoyed this conversation. I'm really glad for everyone that tuned in, really appreciative. And Prue, then my final question to you is just a practical one, is show your content. Where can people find your thoughts and your work if they enjoy what they heard here today and haven't come across you in their feeds yet?
Well, sure. You can find me on YouTube, X, Substack as the Prudentialist. If you want to find all of my links, there's a lovely little website called Find My Friends, FRENS.net/the Prudentialist. You can find me there, and that's where I cover a lot of works. Conversations like these are a really big focus of my channel and a lot of the writing that I do. I occasionally write for the American publication and group, the Old Glory Club. I just wrote an article about the whole term "nothing ever happened," so you can find that. It's my pinned tweet on X, and you'll see it there if you want to understand how I approach the world. But as always, Ernst, I appreciate your time, your company, and to be on your channel. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And like I said, thank you for making the time. I know you are a guest in demand. I just see you constantly being a guest on so many different channels and platforms, and people genuinely, there seems to be a strong interest in your insights. And again, today's conversation has proven why, as I said, not only from my own experience of it and how much I enjoyed it and how fast the time flies when we chat about these topics, but also just judging on how my audience has also reacted to today's conversation. They seem to have enjoyed it very much. If you're new to this channel and you like this type of conversation, you can subscribe, and you can also, if you're watching and it's no longer live, you can still take part and share your thoughts in the comment section. I read all of them and really appreciate your feedback. And then also, if you think you know of someone or have a social media account that you think is followed by people that would enjoy this type of content, you can share it. I really appreciate that as well. And I'll see you guys next week, Tuesday, for the next episode of Stream of Consciousness, regular time. That is 7 p.m. Central Africa time, the Heart of Darkness time zone, literally. And that is next week's guest will be, let me just make sure here. Yes, next week's guest is Dylan Gous. We will be talking about freedom and fulfillment in taking responsibility. So I'm looking forward to that. Dylan has also been a previous guest on this channel, so a lot of you might recognize him. Prudentialist, I'm not going to keep you for any longer. I hope you have a great rest of the day. And once again, thank you for your time and insights, and good luck with all your projects and endeavors and all your writing that you're doing. You're doing a great job.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm going to go to work now. Thanks so much.
All right. Enjoy it. Cheers, guys. Have a good one, and God bless.